Okay, some of the more popular kind of models that are applied today actually are what we call the disease models. These are the most sort of widely accepted models, and your textbook goes into some detail on these. They include what are known as susceptibility models, the idea that people actually inherit, particular genes, for example, that either predispose them to, the liability for developing dependence on particular substances, or help to protect them. So genes for drug metabolism, genes for specific receptors, specific transporters, etc. Some people will have, some particular genetic makeup that predisposes them, to dependence on particular substances, while others will actually be somewhat protected. And, some support for these susceptibility models includes, for example, the well-known fact that, for example, alcoholism may run in families, right? If you have, a grandparent, who was an alcoholic and a parent who's an alcoholic, your risk for, development of alcoholism is actually increased. A very popular model actually now, and a very more widely accepted now, is something known as the exposure model. Or there's a series of these exposure models that have been developed. It's the idea that chronic drug use, taking advantage of these networks and these, changes that are instigated by, increasing exposure, right, to stimulation, for example, of certain receptors, will change the brain, actually. And these network changes will underlie, the loss of control, the craving, the compulsive use, the persistent use. And these exposure models are useful in that they actually provide sort of suggest ways, that you can avoid, dependence and abuse of substances. They might, for example, suggest that, if you don't particularly feel a very strong response from a drug, you should be careful, because in order to get that response, you need to expose your central nervous system to more of it. And the more you expose, the brain to a particular substance, the more changes in the brain will actually result, right? It also suggests that, aspects of exposure, for example, the speed of exposure, how rapidly the drug is delivered to the central nervous system, following the behavior that gets it there. Like if you smoke something, right, very rapidly this drug reaches the central nervous system, that also increases, dependence liability for a substance. So these exposure models are useful in that they tend to, they sort of suggest, ways to, avoid dependence on certain substances, reduce exposure, reduce the sort of speed of exposure. There's some problems with these disease models, though. One of them is, and one you should think about, is sort of societal ambivalence. The idea that, oh, well, alcoholism is basically a genetic disorder, for example. It's a disease, right? We are ambivalent about, turning drug dependence and drug abuse into something that the person has no, direct personal responsibility for, right? That's something that's described to some extent in your book. Part of it is that determining whether somebody is abusing a substance or dependent upon a substance, there are no real lab tests for this. You can't say, oh, they have this gene and that gene, and therefore they're going to become an alcoholic. It's only a list of clinical signs and symptoms described, listed in the DSM-4. There's no sharp line between use and abuse. So how do we, this is all sort of tied into that social ambivalence about, using this susceptibility and exposure approach to describing dependence and abuse.